The luminous secret of Echo's End. The West was a canvas of harsh beauty, but nowhere was it more pronounced than in the desolate reaches surrounding Echo's End. This was no ordinary ghost town. It was a silent sentinel under the gaze of two relentless suns, each burning with an intensity that promised not just heat, but revelation. Legends whispered of a treasure hidden deep within its abandoned mines. Not gold, but something far more profound, something that pulsed with an ancient, forgotten power. Among the few who dared to venture near was Anya Kale, a woman whose elegance seemed utterly out of place in this rugged land. With auburn hair that shone like polished copper and eyes that held the wisdom of forgotten libraries, Anya was an archaeologist, not a gunfighter. She wasn't seeking gold. She was on a desperate quest for the luminous scroll, a mythical artifact said to contain the lost knowledge of a vanished civilization, a truth her own family had secretly guarded for generations before it was stolen. The West was merely her crucible, testing her resolve. But Anya wasn't alone in her pursuit. The very air vibrated with the name of Bud Gayson, the most ruthless outlaw the territories had ever known. His wanted poster, plastered on every decaying post, depicted a man whose eyes were not just cold, but seemed to emit a faint, unholy glow, especially terrifying under the dual glare of the suns. Bud Gayson was obsessed with the luminous scroll, believing it would grant him not just power, but a terrifying vindication of his own madness. He saw the glow in his eyes not as a curse, but as a destined mark. Anya found an unlikely ally in Silas, a grizzled, taciturn man with a meticulously cared-for revolver and a saddle that looked like it had seen 100 deserts. Silas was a tracker of renown, but there was a deeper history to him. He was a former guardian of the very knowledge Anya sought, bound by an ancient oath to protect it. He watched Anya with a quiet intensity, his stoicism hiding a fierce, protective loyalty. Their journey to Echo's End was fraught with peril. They first encountered Jed, an old prospector, his face a roadmap of despair, shielding his eyes from the sun, not just from glare, but from a vision of betrayal that haunted him. Jed knew fragments of the scroll's legend, whispered by the wind, but terror had silenced him for years. Bud Gayson's gang had captured and tortured him, forcing him to reveal what he knew. Further along, they stumbled upon Cole, a young prospector, his face a mask of pure terror. He had accidentally unearthed a crucial clue, a strange, star-shaped stone, and had been relentlessly hunted by Bud Gayson's men ever since. Anya, with her knowledge of ancient symbols, immediately recognized its significance. And then there was Rance, a formidable figure, his face contorted in anger. He was a distant descendant of the original Guardians, like Silas, but had been consumed by a burning rage after his family was wiped out by a previous attempt to steal the scroll. He wanted not to protect the knowledge, but to destroy it, believing its existence only brought suffering. The deeper they delved into Echo's End, the more the pieces of the puzzle aligned. The luminous scroll was not a map to gold, nor a spell for power. It contained the blueprints for a sustainable, self-sufficient society ***, harnessing the desert's energy, transforming its harshness into harmony. It was the legacy of a people who had understood the balance of nature and sought to create a utopia, a truly beautiful knowledge. Bud Gayson, however, interpreted the power within it as a tool for domination, to control the suns themselves. Anya faced constant moral dilemmas. Should she risk everything to retrieve a knowledge that might be too dangerous for the world? Should she seek revenge against Bud Gayson, or simply protect the scroll? Silas, always observing, subtly guided her towards the path of guardianship, reminding her of her ancestor' sacrifice. The final confrontation took place in the heart of Echo's End, deep within the crumbling ruins of what was once a grand observatory, now exposed to the blinding glare of the two suns. The air crackled with a strange energy. Bud Gayson was already there, his glowing eyes fixed on a pedestal where the scroll was meant to reside. He believed the combined light of the two suns at this specific hour would activate its full power. He stood surrounded by his last remaining men, their faces grim but resolute. "It's mine," Bud Gayson roared, his voice echoing through the ruins, his eyes blazing brighter than ever. "The power to command this land, to remake it in my image." Anya stepped forward, followed by Silas, Jed, who had found a flicker of courage, Cole, clutching his starstone, and Rance, his anger battling his sense of duty. The fight was not merely with bullets. It was a clash of ideals. Thorne's strategic mind from a past life guided their movements. Clint, the stoic protector, positioned himself for the crucial shot. The climax was sensational. As Bud Gayson lunged for the empty pedestal, believing the scroll would materialize, Anya revealed it, not as a physical parchment, but as a complex, almost living light pattern reflected through the starstone Cole had found. It was a projection of intricate diagrams and equations, not words, designed to be understood by the enlightened. Bud Gayson's glowing eyes were not a mark of power, but a side effect of a rare mineral poisoning, enhancing his vision but also driving him mad with delusions of grandeur. Enraged, Bud Gayson fired at Anya, but Silas, quick as a desert snake, blocked the shot. Rance, momentarily letting go of his anger, helped secure Cole. Jed, remembering his betrayal, used his knowledge of the ruins to collapse a section, isolating Bud Gayson. The final showdown was between Bud Gayson and Silas, a silent duel of wills and bullets. Silas, with a heavy heart, fired the fatal shot. Bud Gayson fell, his glowing eyes fading to a dull, lifeless stare, consumed by the very madness he embraced. Anya knelt, picking up the fallen starstone. The luminous scroll wasn't a magic spell. It was a blueprint for a harmonious existence, a testament to humanity's potential for ingenuity and peace. She looked at Silas, then at the desolate land bathed in the glow of the two suns. The story concluded not with a grand explosion, but with a quiet, profound triumph. Anya, instead of hoarding the knowledge, chose to share it. She and Silas began to teach the remaining townsfolk, using the scroll's wisdom to find water, cultivate desert-resistant crops, and harness solar energy. The former ghost town of Echoes Inn slowly began to bloom, a beacon of hope born from ancient wisdom and selfless courage. The harsh desert remained, but now, under the gaze of the two suns, there was not just heat, but the warmth of shared purpose, a truly beautiful legacy rising from the dust. The sun beat down on Whisperwind Gulch with a vengeance, two blazing orbs in the sky seemingly conspiring to bake the very life out of the earth. It was a place where hope had dried up faster than a desert creek, a forgotten speck on the vast canvas of the American West. Marshall Thorne, a man whose glory days were long behind him, had sought refuge here, hoping the perpetual dust and silence would bury the ghosts of his past. He often stood, shielding his eyes from the relentless glare, trying to blot out not just the sun, but the memories that seared deeper than any desert heat. Thorne carried the weight of a monumental failure, a town he couldn't save, a family he couldn't protect. His uniform was long shed, replaced by the nondescript clothes of a prospector, but the lawman's burden clung to him like burrs. He just wanted to disappear, to let the wind whisper away his name. But the West rarely granted peace to the weary. The threat loomed large, plastered on every peeling wall, a wanted poster bearing the image of Bud Gayson near your eye. His eyes, a chillingly accurate depiction of the rumors, seemed to glow with an unnatural, malevolent light, promising destruction. Bud Gayson wasn't just a bandit. He was a force of nature, ruthlessly expanding his dominion, choking off remote settlements like Whisperwind Gulch by cutting off supply lines and terrorizing the few prospectors who still dared to chip away at the barren hills. The townsfolk, a haggard lot, lived in a constant state of dread, their faces etched with a mix of fear and simmering anger. Old man Silas, whose eyes always darted nervously, had seen Bud Gayson's cruelty up close. Young Jeb, whose face was a mask of raw fury, had lost his meager claim to Bud's expanding empire. One sweltering afternoon, a new shadow fell over Whisperwind Gulch, a quiet, stoic figure rode in, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, a thick, coppery beard catching the sunlight. He dismounted, a well-worn saddle slung over his shoulder, a gleaming revolver holstered low on his hip. This was Clint. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man on a mission, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. He rented a small, run-down cabin and kept to himself, though his presence, calm and formidable, was noted by all. Among the few pillars left in Whisperwind Gulch was Eleanor Vance. Sharp, intelligent, and fiercely determined, Eleanor ran the town's general mercantile, trying to keep her family's legacy afloat despite Bud Gayson's stranglehold. She watched Thorne with a wary eye. She'd seen enough lawmen abandon their posts to trust easily. Yet, desperation gnawed at her. Supplies were dwindling, and fear was turning into despair. Thorne initially wanted no part of it. He'd seen the wanted poster, heard the terrified whispers. He'd even seen the frantic face of a young prospector, screaming in terror after encountering Bud Gayson's men. He just shook his head, retreating deeper into his self-imposed exile, shielding his face not from the sun, but from the appeals in their eyes. The tipping point came with the chilling news that Bud Gayson's gang had systematically burned every family farm in a nearby valley, kidnapping the children and demanding impossible ransoms. This was not mere banditry. It was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. It snapped something in Thorne. He looked at the haunted faces around him, the despair in Eleanor's eyes, the sheer terror in Silas's, the raw anger in Jeb's. He couldn't hide anymore. That evening, in the dusty saloon, Thorne stood up. His voice, rusty from disuse, carried surprising authority. "We can't just wait to die," he declared, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Bud Gayson won't stop until there's nothing left." Clint, who had been silently nursing a drink, set his glass down. "He knows this land better than any man alive," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I know him." A stunned silence fell. Clint looked up, his eyes meeting Thorne's. "I rode with him once, before his eyes started burning like that, before he lost whatever soul he had." Clint revealed that he had been hunting Bud Gayson for months, seeking to atone for his past association. The saddle he carried wasn't just equipment. It was a symbol of his solitary, relentless journey. A plan began to form. Thorne, with his old lawman's tactical mind, Clint, with his intimate knowledge of Bud Gayson's methods and hideouts, and Eleanor, with her precise understanding of the local landscape and dwindling resources, started to forge a desperate strategy. They would use the very harshness of the desert against Bud Gayson, luring him into a carefully chosen ambush point, a narrow pass where the relentless sun beat down, creating mirages and sapping strength. The showdown was set. As the sun reached its zenith, two blinding discs in the bleached sky, Bud Gayson and his riders galloped into the trap. Bud Gayson, a monstrous figure, his red beard ablaze in the sunlight, his legendary eyes indeed seeming to glow with an eerie, internal fire, laughed as he saw the small, defiant group waiting. "Looks like some lambs came to the slaughter," he bellowed, drawing his shining revolver. But Thorne was no lamb. His gun, old but true, barked first, clipping one of Bud Gayson's men. Clint, moving like a phantom, appeared on a ridge, his own revolver spitting fire. He knew Bud Gayson's tics, his favorite moves, and anticipated them. Eleanor, from a hidden position, signaled to a group of townsfolk they had armed, who then released a strategically placed rock slide, creating chaos and confusion among the gang. The battle raged under the twin suns. Dust, gunpowder, and the desperate cries of men filled the air. Thorne moved with the renewed purpose of a man given a second chance, his years of experience guiding his aim. Clint, driven by a deeply personal vendetta, engaged Bud Gayson in a brutal, up-close fight, their revolvers flashing. Bud Gayson's eyes burned with a maniacal rage, but Clint, knowing the man's every weakness, fought with a cold, precise fury. Finally, with a gut-wrenching shot, Clint hit Bud Gayson squarely. The infamous outlaw staggered, his glowing eyes dimming. and he fell, a legend collapsing into the dust from which he rose. A weary silence descended. The fight was over. Whisperwind Gulch was free. Thorn, though bruised and exhausted, felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. He looked at the grateful faces of Eleanor, Silas, and Jeb. He hadn't fully buried his past, but he had finally found a measure of redemption. Clint, his mission fulfilled, simply nodded to Thorn and Eleanor. He took his saddle, swung it over his shoulder, and walked towards the horizon, a solitary figure disappearing into the fading light. Another phantom of the West moving on. Whisperwind Gulch, scarred but victorious, began the long, hard journey of healing, a testament to the day they faced their fears under the blazing twin suns and won. Beyond the dusty horizon, where thorny bushes and rugged rock formations stretched endlessly, lay Sundown City. Its name, though seemingly mystical, belied a harsh and unforgiving reality, much like nature itself. Life for the residents of this town revolved around the sound of gunfire and the thud of horse hooves. Among them were several notable individuals whose destinies intertwined on one peculiar evening. First, there was Old Jack, with his cowboy hat, a furrowed brow, and an old rifle in hand. Jack was both the protector and the enigma of Sundown City. It was rumored that many years ago, he had been a notorious outlaw, but after some unknown incident, he changed his ways and began living as the town's guardian. Yet, his past always remained shrouded in mystery. Next was Callie, the owner of the town's only saloon. With her reddish hair, sharp gaze, and sweet smile, Callie was the heart and soul of Sundown City. Even in dire situations, she never lost her courage and always tried to bring smiles to people's faces. However, beneath her smile lay a deep sorrow that she never let anyone see. One day, a stranger arrived in Sundown City, Eagle-Eye Dan. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle's, and his hand with a gun was lightning fast. It was clear from Dan's demeanor that he had come with a specific purpose. He seemed somewhat worried while checking his horse's saddle outside the town, as if he had lost something valuable. That very day, wanted posters appeared on the outskirts of the town, featuring a notorious bandit named Bud Gayson-Urine. Many townsfolk flinched at the sight of his burning eyes on the poster. It was said that wherever Bud Gayson went, he brought destruction. Countless murders and robberies were linked to his name. Just a few days later, Bud Gayson-Urine's gang truly attacked Sundown City. They were far superior in number and armed with advanced firearms. Although initially terrified, the townspeople, led by Old Jack, stood their ground. Callie closed her saloon doors, comforting those who sought shelter inside, while Eagle-Eye Dan moved around the town's nooks and crannies, keeping an eye on the bandits' movements. The gunfight began. The air grew heavy with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Jack, with his old rifle, accurately picked off bandits one by one. Callie, from her saloon window, took opportune shots. But the bandits were too numerous, and slowly, they began to take control of the town. Just then, Eagle-Eye Dan appeared as a savior. He swiftly leaped from one rooftop to another, raining bullets down on the bandits. With his impeccable aim, one bandit after another fell to the ground. Inspired by Dan's courage and skill, the townspeople found new resolve. But the fight was not yet over. Bud Gayson-Urine, with that terrifying gaze seen on the poster, had been hiding, waiting to witness the town's downfall. When he saw that his gang was almost defeated, he stepped forward himself. In his hand was a gleaming revolver, and in his eyes, the fire of ferocity. Bud Gayson aimed his gun directly at Callie and fired. Callie closed her eyes in fear, but the bullet did not hit her. In a split second, Eagle-Eye Dan rushed forward, pushing Callie out of the way, and took Bud Gayson's bullet himself. Before Dan fell to the ground, he drew his own revolver and shot Bud Gayson in the chest. Bud Gayson let out a horrific scream and collapsed, the fiery gaze in his eyes slowly extinguishing. Eagle-Eye Dan was also severely wounded. Callie rushed to him and began to cry, holding him. Dan managed a weak smile and said, "I think I found what I was looking for." Then his breath faded. The people of Sundown City celebrated their victory, but a deep sorrow filled their hearts. They realized that Eagle-Eye Dan had sacrificed his life to save their town. What he had been looking for while checking his horse's saddle was perhaps the hope for a new life, which he had found among the people of Sundown City. Old Jack silently. Once upon a time, in the dusty, sun-scorched lands of the Wild West, there was a notorious outlaw named Bud Gayson-Urirai. His name echoed through the canyons and saloons, a whisper of fear and a legend in the making. Bud wasn't just any bandit. Rumors claimed his eyes glowed with an unholy fire, a mark of a pact made with shadows in the deepest caverns. The wanted posters plastered across every town bore a stark image of a man with a wild, untamed beard and eyes that indeed seemed to pierce through the paper itself. Our story begins in the small, beleaguered town of Redemption Gulch. The townsfolk lived under a perpetual cloud of anxiety, ever wary of Bud Gayson's next raid. Their once vibrant community was now subdued, their laughter stifled by the looming threat. Among them lived a young woman named Clara, fiercely independent and possessing a spirit as fiery as the desert sun. Clara ran the town's only general store after her father's passing. She was the heart of Redemption Gulch, her resilience a beacon of hope in their troubled times. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly, a group of dusty travelers stumbled into Redemption Gulch. They were a motley crew. Jedediah, a grizzled old prospector with tales etched on his weathered face. Silas, a quiet and observant man with a knack for tinkering with machines, and a charismatic but shifty-eyed gambler known only as the Serpent. They claimed to be passing through, but there was a palpable tension in their demeanor, a hidden agenda that Clara couldn't quite decipher. As the travelers settled in the town's meager saloon, a commotion erupted outside. A lone rider galloped into town, his face pale with terror. "Bud Gayson," he gasped, pointing back the way he came. "He's coming this way. They say he's got a whole gang with him this time." Panic seized Redemption Gulch. The townsfolk scrambled to barricade their homes and businesses, their fear turning into a desperate resolve to protect what little they had. Clara, though frightened, felt a surge of defiance. She wouldn't let Bud Gayson terrorize her town any longer. Meanwhile, the travelers in the saloon exchanged knowing glances. Jedediah clutched a worn leather-bound map. Silas nervously adjusted something hidden beneath his coat, and the Serpent's eyes gleamed with anticipation. It was clear they knew more than they were letting on about Bud Gayson's impending arrival. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, the ominous sound of approaching horses echoed through the stillness. Bud Gayson-Urirai and his gang descended upon Redemption Gulch like a pack of wolves. They were a rough and menacing bunch, armed to the teeth and with a hunger for plunder in their eyes. Bud, a towering figure with a thick, fiery red beard and those unsettling eyes, surveyed the town with a cruel smirk. Well, he drawled, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little lamb waiting to be fleeced." The gang charged into the town, their gunfire shattering the fragile peace. The townsfolk, though outnumbered, fought back with surprising courage, defending their homes and families. Clara, armed with her father's old shotgun, stood firm behind the counter of her store, taking aim at any outlaw who dared to approach. Amidst the chaos, the travelers revealed their true intentions. Jedediah unfurled his map, revealing a hidden passage leading out of Redemption Gulch. Silas unveiled a cleverly disguised Gatling gun, which he expertly positioned to provide cover fire. And the Serpent, surprisingly agile, darted through the streets, sowing confusion among the outlaws. It turned out that these travelers were not mere wanderers. They were bounty hunters, each with their own reasons for wanting to bring down Bud Gayson-Urirai. Jedediah had lost his claim to Bud's treachery. Silas's family had been victimized by the outlaws' gang, and the Serpent, despite his shady demeanor, had a personal vendetta against Bud. A fierce gunfight ensued. Bullets whizzed through the air, and the dusty streets became a battleground. Clara, inspired by the bravery of the bounty hunters and the resilience of her fellow townsfolk, fought with unwavering determination. She even managed to take a shot at Bud Gayson himself, grazing his arm and earning a furious glare from the outlaw leader. The fight raged on until dawn broke, casting long shadows across the ravaged town. One by one, Bud Gayson's gang members fell, their reign of terror finally coming to an end in the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch. Cornered and wounded, Bud Gayson faced the combined might of the bounty hunters and the townsfolk. In a final, desperate move, Bud lunged at Clara, his eyes burning with an unholy light. But before he could reach her, Silas's Gatling gun roared to life, riddling the outlaw with a volley of bullets. Bud Gayson Urine, the terror of the Wild West, fell silent in the dust. A collective sigh of relief swept through Redemption Gulch. The nightmare was finally over. The townsfolk emerged from their barricaded homes, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes shining with newfound hope. Clara, standing amidst the debris, looked at the bounty hunters with gratitude. "You saved us," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Jedediah smiled, his weathered face crinkling at the corners. "We had our own reasons, Miss Clara, but it was your town's spirit that truly turned the tide." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over Redemption Gulch, the townsfolk began the arduous task of rebuilding. The scars of the battle would remain, but so would the memory of their courage and resilience. And Clara, the heart of Redemption Gulch, knew that their town, though shaken, was finally on the path to healing and a brighter future, free from the shadow of Bud Gayson Urine. The legend of the glowing-eyed outlaw would forever be a part of their history, a reminder of the day Redemption Gulch truly earned its name. The bitter feast. The stench hung heavy in the small, one-room hovel, a cloying miasma of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet aroma of decay. Alara coughed, the sound a dry, rasping echo in the oppressive silence that had fallen over their meager meal. Across the rough-hewn wooden table, Thomas chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the crumbling mud walls. His face, usually etched with a weary kindness, was now a mask of grim determination, tinged with a disturbing pallor. Beside him, young Maeve watched with wide, terrified eyes, her small hand clutching Alara's calloused fingers so tightly that her knuckles were white. On the cracked earthenware plate before Thomas lay the remnants of their grim sustenance. A half-eaten rat, its fur matted and greasy, its tiny teeth bared in a final, silent snarl. Two more of the creatures lay sprawled on the table's edge, their lifeless bodies stiff and cold. A skeletal fish, picked clean weeks ago and saved for whatever meager nutrients might still cling to its brittle frame, sat on another plate, untouched. Beside it, a hunk of bread, green with mold and hard as stone, mocked their hunger. Alara's stomach churned, a familiar knot of nausea tightening in her gut. She had managed a few mouthfuls of the stale bread, the taste like dust and despair in her mouth. Maeve had refused even that, her small face pale and pinched. But Thomas had eaten the rat. He had picked it up, its cold, stiff form a testament to their desperation, and devoured it with a grim resolve that both terrified and humbled Alara. Their village, nestled beside the whispering reeds of the fenlands, had once been a place of simple rhythms and quiet contentment. The land, though unforgiving, had provided enough. They had fished in the murky waters, gathered reeds for their roofs and baskets, and cultivated small patches of hardy grain in the drier patches of earth. Life had been a cycle of hard work and meager reward, but had been life nonetheless. Then had come the sickness, a creeping pestilence that had swept through the village like a scythe through ripe wheat. It had started with a fever, a burning heat that left its victims weak and delirious. Then came the coughing, a racking, bloody expulsion that stole breath and life in equal measure. One by one, their neighbors had succumbed, their bodies wrapped in simple shrouds and buried in the hastily dug graves at the edge of the marsh. The sickness had spared Alara, Thomas, and Maeve, but it had taken something else: their community. Those who remained were too few, too weak to tend the fields or fish the waters effectively. The meager stores of grain had dwindled, the fish grew scarce, and the familiar bounty of the land had turned into a cruel mockery of their hunger. Winter had followed the sickness, a relentless, biting cold that seeped into their bones and gnawed at their resolve. The fun froze, trapping what little life remained in its icy grip. The few animals they had kept, a scrawny pig, a handful of chickens, had long since been eaten. Now, even the rats, once a scurrying nuisance, were becoming harder to find, their numbers decimated by the harsh conditions and the desperate hunger of the survivors. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of gnawing hunger and bone-deep cold. They huddled together for warmth, sharing their dwindling breaths in the frigid air. Alara told Maeve stories of sun-drenched summers and bountiful harvests, tales that seemed like distant dreams, almost fantastical in their current reality. Thomas, his usual optimism dimmed but not extinguished, would try to find small tasks to occupy them, mending their tattered clothes or reinforcing the crumbling walls of their hovel. But the hunger grew, a relentless, gnawing beast that clawed at their insides and clouded their minds. They tried everything. They boiled scraps of leather until they were a gelatinous mess, hoping to extract some sustenance from the tough fibers. They foraged in the frozen marsh for any stray roots or berries, their fingers numb with cold and their hopes dwindling with each fruitless search. They even tried to trap birds, setting crude snares with frayed bits of string, but the few birds that braved the winter winds were wary and elusive. Then had come the rats, driven by hunger as desperate as their own. The creatures had begun to venture into their hovel, their eyes gleaming in the dim light of their meager fire. At first, Alara had been repulsed, her stomach lurching at the sight of the vermin that usually scurried away from human presence. But as the days stretched into weeks and their bellies remained empty, a horrifying thought had begun to take root in her mind. She had voiced it one evening, her voice barely a whisper in the gloom. We could try to eat them." Thomas had looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and despair. "Alara, they are filthy. They carry disease. And we carry hunger," she had retorted, the desperation in her voice sharp. "Which is the greater threat now, Thomas?" Maeve had whimpered, burying her face in Alara's side. The thought of eating the creatures that scurried in the shadows was terrifying to the child. But the logic of Alara's words was undeniable. They were starving. Their bodies were wasting away. They had no other source of food. The first rat they caught had been small and scrawny. Thomas had killed it quickly with a heavy stone, his face grim. Alara had tried to cook it over their small fire, but the smell was sickening, the flesh tough and unappetizing. She had managed a few small bites, forcing them down despite the revulsion that rose in her throat. Maeve had refused outright, her eyes wide with disgust. Thomas had tried a little, his expression a mixture of distaste and grim acceptance. The next few rats had been equally unpalatable, offering little more than a fleeting sense of fullness followed by a lingering nausea. But they were sustenance of a sort. They kept the gnawing emptiness at bay, even if the thought of them made Alara's stomach churn. Today, however, had been different. They had managed to catch 2 larger rats in their makeshift traps. Thomas, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow with hunger, had taken one of them and, without even attempting to cook it properly, had begun to eat it raw. Alara had watched in horror, her own hunger momentarily forgotten in the face of his desperate act. The raw flesh, the tiny bones crunching between his teeth, the blood smearing his lips. It was a scene that would forever be etched into her memory. "Thomas," she had whispered, her voice trembling. He had stopped chewing, his eyes meeting hers. There was a wildness in them, a flicker of something akin to madness born of starvation. "We have to survive, Alara. We have to survive for Maeve." The biting wind of the harsh winter, a relentless guest in their small, dilapidated cottage nestled on the outskirts of a quiet village in Bengal, seeped through every crack and crevice. It carried the mournful whispers of the barren fields and the distant, hollow cries of stray dogs, sounds that mirrored the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Inside, the feeble glow of a single oil lamp, precariously perched on a wobbly stool, fought a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. The air, thick with the dampness of the mud walls and the stale scent of worry, hung heavy, a tangible weight on their weary shoulders. Elias, his once strong hands now calloused and trembling, cradled little Thomas, his youngest, a fragile life wrapped in a patched and faded crimson cloth. The infant stirred restlessly, a weak, rattling cough escaping his tiny chest, a sound that pierced Elias's heart like shards of ice. Beside him leaned his faithful shovel, its iron blade dull with disuse. The frozen earth outside lay unyielding, a stark reminder of the lack of work, the empty promises of the moneylenders, and the ever-present shadow of starvation that loomed over their lives. The land, usually generous, now offered only hardship. Under the lamp's flickering dance, Agnes and Martha, their faces pale and gaunt, toiled with a grim determination over a wooden tub. The water within was icy, drawn from the half-frozen pond earlier that day, yet they plunged their chapped hands in again and again, scrubbing the few meager pieces of clothing they possessed. The weary creak and groan of the wringer as they squeezed out the frigid water was the only consistent sound, a mournful rhythm accompanying their silent struggle. Their eyes, large and distressed, constantly flickered between the sleeping baby, the dwindling flame of the lamp, and the small, pathetic pile of washed clothes. Each turn of the wringer seemed to extract not just water from the fabric, but also a little more of their already depleted hope. Young Alara, a wisp of a girl with eyes that held an understanding far beyond her 6 years, sat huddled in the darkest corner of the room. She clutched a worn-out, faceless doll, its fabric softened by countless hugs and silent tears. Her gaze, wide and filled with innocent concern, never strayed far from her baby brother. She seemed to sense the oppressive weight that hung in the air, the unspoken anxieties that tightened her mother's lips and furrowed her father's brow. On the floor beside the lamp sat a shallow, earthenware bowl, holding their meager sustenance, a handful of small, nobble potatoes, their skins bearing the marks of a poor harvest. These were their last, and they knew not when or where the next meal would come from. The silence of the long winter night outside pressed against the fragile walls of their home, amplifying their fear and isolation. The distant howl of a jackal seemed like a mournful omen. The days ahead stretched before them, a bleak and unforgiving landscape, mirroring the frozen fields that offered no solace. Yet, amidst the despair, in the shared glances between husband and wife, mother and daughter, there flickered a tiny ember of resilience, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the encroaching darkness. They would face the winter, as they had faced every hardship before, together, clinging to the fragile hope that spring, however distant, would eventually return to their weary land. The bitter feast part two. He had continued to eat, his movements mechanical, his face devoid of emotion. Alara had turned away, tears stinging her eyes. The line between survival and savagery was blurring, and she feared what they might become in their desperation. Now, the silence in the hovel was broken only by the occasional sigh from Maeve and the soft sounds of Thomas's chewing. Alara looked at her daughter, her small face pale and drawn, and a wave of fierce protectiveness washed over her. She would do anything to keep Maeve alive, even if it meant facing her own revulsion and despair. She looked back at Thomas, his face now smeared with blood and grime. He was their protector, their provider, and the burden he carried was immense. To resort to eating raw vermin, it spoke volumes of the depth of their desperation. As the last of the rat disappeared down Thomas's throat, he let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Alara, his eyes regaining a sliver of their former clarity. It was not good, he said, his voice hoarse, but it filled the emptiness. Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She knew it was more than just the emptiness that had been filled. Something else had been consumed in that desperate act, something precious and fragile within them. The day wore on, each hour a heavy weight of hunger and cold. Thomas laid down on their straw pallet, his body still and silent. Alara worried about him. The raw meat, what diseases could it carry? But she knew better than to voice her fears. He had done what he felt he had to do. As darkness fell, the wind howled outside, rattling the flimsy door of their hovel. Maeve snuggled closer to Alara, her small body trembling. Alara held her tight, whispering soft words of comfort, though her own heart was heavy with dread. Suddenly, there was a scratching sound at the door. Alara froze, her senses on high alert. They had had no visitors for months. Who would be out in this bitter night? The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Thomas stirred on the pallet, his eyes opening slowly. "Who is it?" Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. There was a muffled sound from the other side of the door, a weak, almost whimpering noise. Thomas pushed himself up, his movements stiff and slow. He reached for the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Alara and Maeve. With a grunt, he lifted the bar and slowly pulled the door open. A blast of icy wind swept into the hovel, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something faintly familiar. Huddled on their doorstep, shivering and covered in a thin layer of snow, were two figures. One was small and frail, wrapped in tattered furs. The other was larger, its form obscured by a heavy cloak. As the larger figure raised its head, a gasp escaped Alara's lips. It was Agnes, the widow from the next farm over, a woman they had thought had perished during sickness. And clutched tightly in her arms was a small, whimpering lamb. "Agnes!" Alara cried, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. Agnes's face was thin and pale, her eyes sunken, but a flicker of recognition lit them as she looked at Alara. "Alara, we need help." Her voice was weak and raspy. Thomas helped them inside, his weariness momentarily forgotten. Agnes sank onto the floor, cradling the lamb protectively. The small child wrapped in furs whimpered softly. "It's my grandson, Finn," Agnes explained, her voice trembling. "His parents, they both succumbed to the sickness. We have been wandering, searching for others." Alara quickly helped them settle by the fire, offering them the meager warmth of the dying embers. She looked at the lamb, her heart pounding in her chest. It was small, barely more than a few weeks old, but it was food, real food. But as she looked at Agnes's gaunt face and the frail form of the child, a sense of empathy washed over her. They were all survivors, clinging to life by a thread. Could she bring herself to take their only source of sustenance? Thomas, however, seemed to have no such qualms. His eyes were fixed on the lamb, a primal hunger gleaming in their depths. "We have nothing left, Agnes," he said, his voice rough. "We are starving." Agnes looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate understanding. "I know," she whispered. "We are too. But he is just a lamb. He will not feed us for long. But he will feed us now," Thomas countered, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the small hovel was thick and heavy, the unspoken question hanging in the frigid air. Who was more deserving of survival? Their small family, who had endured the sickness and the bitter winter, or Agnes and her orphan grandson, who had also suffered unimaginable loss? Alara looked at Maeve, her daughter's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope as she looked at the lamb. She looked at Thomas, his face etched with a desperate hunger. And she looked at Agnes, her face a mask of weary resignation. The answer, she knew, was not a simple one. There was no easy choice in this brutal reality they now inhabited. They were all victims of a cruel fate, forced to make impossible decisions in the face of unimaginable hardship. As the wind continued to howl outside, a new kind of storm brewed within the small hovel, a storm of desperation, empathy, and the agonizing weight of survival. The bitter feast they had just endured was a stark reminder of the depths to which they had sunk. The arrival of Agnes and Finn, with their fragile hope in the form of a small lamb, presented a new and equally agonizing dilemma. What would they do? What could they do? In this desolate landscape of loss and hunger, the lines of morality were blurred, and the fight for survival had become a desperate, all-consuming battle. The coming days would test the very limits of their humanity, forcing them to confront the true cost of survival in a world stripped bare of compassion and plenty. The story of the bitter feast was far from over. It was merely the prelude to an even more harrowing chapter in their struggle to live. A very long and boring history of the village of Elderwillow. In a quiet and mostly uneventful corner of the world, nestled between low hills and a small river that never overflowed, there once stood a village called Elderwillow. Elderwillow was not famous for anything in particular. It was not a place where battles were fought or where great kings were crowned. It was simply there. The village had existed for as long as anyone could remember. No one knew exactly when it was founded. Some said it began with a man named Orban, who built the first house out of flat stones and willow branches. Others believed it simply appeared one day, already complete, though that story was less popular and often told only to entertain sleepy children. For hundreds of years, Elderwillow grew at a very slow and predictable rate. A new cottage would be built every few decades. A field would be expanded by a few feet every other generation. The people there liked things to remain as they were, and they liked talking about the weather, especially when the weather hadn't changed. The villagers mostly grew barley and turnips. Occasionally, someone would try to grow something new, like carrots or possibly even cabbage, but they often gave up halfway through the planting season. It wasn't because they were lazy, but because the barley and turnips worked just fine and they saw no reason to complicate things. Each morning, the sun would rise over the low hills to the east. The light would spill slowly over the thatched roofs, gently warming the dew off the stone walls. Roosters would crow, sheep would bleat, and the villagers would stir from their wooden beds. Breakfast consisted of porridge, usually plain. Sometimes, when someone was feeling adventurous, they might add a pinch of salt. There was a village meeting once every 4 months. At this meeting, the townsfolk discussed issues like the condition of the walking path or whether the communal bench by the willow tree needed resanding. They always ended with the same conclusion: we'll think about it some more. Generations passed like this. Children grew up, helped in the fields, and then grew old. They passed on their skills, their recipes, and their love of extremely mild stories to the next generation. There was a family named the Featherpokes who had maintained the same duck pond for over 200 years. No one else really cared for the ducks, but they appreciated the Featherpokes for caring so reliably. Every year, the village held a harvest appreciation afternoon. Not a festival, not a celebration, just an afternoon of light discussion under the old elm tree near the western pasture. There was no music. There was usually some sitting. Occasionally someone would hum. Elderwillow had a mayor, though the role was mostly ceremonial. The mayor's main duty was to wear a slightly darker hat on Tuesday mornings and to remind people when the harvest appreciation afternoon was approaching. The current mayor, Mrs. Haddleweather, had held the position for 42 years, and in that time, she had written exactly 3 announcements. All of them began with, as you were probably already aware. The village also had a library with 4 books. One was a recipe book for stewed barley. One was an outdated manual on animal husbandry, which nobody read anymore because everyone already knew what was in it. The third was a book of local sayings, such as, if it's not broken, don't poke it, and a steady wind means a steady day. The fourth book was a journal written by a man who once thought he saw a deer with 2 tails. The entry was short. I believe I saw a deer with 2 tails. It might have been a trick of the light. Winter in Elderwillow came gently. Snow would drift down like powdered flour, never too much, never too little. Fires would be lit in the stone hearths, and people would gather to knit, read the same stories, and fall asleep in chairs. The snow would melt slowly by the end of March, revealing the same walkways, the same turnip beds, the same unchanged world. The only real excitement in Elderwillow happened once, many years ago, when someone accidentally left the village gate open and a goat wandered into the schoolhouse. The goat chewed on a geography scroll before being let out. To this day, people still mention the goat incident as a reminder to always latch the gate. But even that story is told with such calm detail and repetition that it rarely keeps anyone awake. Elderwillow never made it into the maps of kings, nor did travelers speak of it in distant inns. It simply existed as it had for centuries. It was a place where time passed like a slow stream, steady, quiet, and without ripples. And as the sun set behind the familiar hills, casting long shadows over the barley fields and turnip rows, the people of Elder Willow would once again prepare for bed, knowing tomorrow would be just like today, and perhaps a little quieter. If you're still awake, just imagine that slow river. Picture its gentle waters flowing endlessly between smooth stones. Nothing is changing, nothing is rushing. Just a peaceful flow in the background, like time itself falling asleep. Good night. The case of the missing mangoes. The midday sun beat down on the sleepy village of Amtalai, its rays shimmering off the placid surface of the pond. Usually, the air would be filled with the cheerful banter of children and the rhythmic thud of mangoes falling on a soft earth. But today, a palpable tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like the pre-monsoon humidity. The matter at hand, the great mango heist. Old Man Rahim, the proud owner of the largest and juiciest mango orchard in Amdalai, had discovered it that morning. A significant portion of his prized Alfonso mangoes, the ones destined for the capital's high-end markets, had vanished overnight. No forced entry, no footprints, just empty branches where plump, golden fruit had hung only hours before. Panic had rippled through the village, not just for Rahim's loss, but for the unsettling nature of the crime. It was as if the mangoes had simply evaporated into thin air. Enter Detective Inspector Kamal Hossein, a man known for his sharp intellect and even sharper mustache. He arrived in Amtalai in a dusty jeep, his gaze immediately taking in the scene. Rahim, a picture of distress, wrung his hands, recounting the events of the previous night. "I swear, Inspector," Rahim rasped, his voice thick with emotion, "I locked the gates myself. The dogs didn't bark. Nothing. It's as if ghosts came and plucked them clean." Kamal surveyed the orchard. The mango trees stood laden with the remaining fruit, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. He noted the lack of any discernible tracks on the soft soil around the trees. He questioned the night watchman, a young lad named Farouk, who swore he had seen and heard nothing unusual. Days turned into a week, and the mystery deepened. Kamal interviewed every villager, from the baker to the boatman, but no one could offer a plausible explanation. Some whispered about supernatural forces, others suspected rival orchard owners, but no concrete evidence emerged. Kamal found himself drawn to the seemingly insignificant details. He revisited the orchard multiple times, meticulously examining the ground, the trees, even the discarded mango leaves. He learned everything about Rahim's routines, his relationships with other villagers, and the usual patterns of life in Amtalai. One sweltering afternoon, as he sat under the shade of a banyan tree near the pond, observing children playing, something clicked. He watched as one boy cleverly used a long, hooked stick to pull down a guava from a high branch. An idea began to form in Kamal's mind. He returned to Rahim's orchard, and this time, he focused his attention upwards, high up in the canopy of the largest mango tree. Almost hidden by the dense foliage, he spotted faint but distinct scratch marks on a thick branch. He called for a ladder and carefully climbed up. There, partially concealed by leaves, he found what he was looking for, a long, sturdy bamboo pole with a hook fashioned at its end and fragments of mango skin clinging to the hook. The method was ingenious, albeit laborious. The thief, or thieves, had likely used these hook poles to pluck the mangoes from the higher branches during the dead of night, carefully avoiding the lower ones to make it seem like fewer were missing initially. The lack of ground tracks was explained by the fact that they didn't need to get directly under most of the trees. But who were the culprits? Kamal gathered the villagers again. He explained his deduction about the hook poles. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, his gaze settled on a group of young men who had been unusually quiet throughout the investigation. They were known for their agility and their tendency to engage in mischievous pranks. Under Kamal's persistent questioning, one of them finally broke down. It turned out that a group of 5 young men, driven by boredom and a desire for some quick money, had hatched the plan. They had observed Raheem's routine, knew the orchard layout, and, under the cover of darkness, had systematically plucked the ripest mangoes using the hook poles. They had then transported the loot in small batches along the narrow village paths, avoiding the main road, and sold them in a neighboring market. The recovered mangoes were a bit bruised, but still valuable. Raheem was overjoyed, not just at the recovery of his fruit, but at the unraveling of the mystery that had gripped his village. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Amtalai, Detective Inspector Kamal Hossein sat sipping tea, the tension in the air finally replaced by a sense of relief and renewed peace. The case of the missing mangoes was closed, another testament to the power of observation and a mind that could see beyond the obvious, even in the most seemingly simple of villages. The sun beat down on Whisperwind Gulch with a vengeance, two blazing orbs in the sky seemingly conspiring to bake the very life out of the earth. It was a place where hope had dried up faster than a desert creek, a forgotten speck on the vast canvas of the American West. Marshall Thorne, a man whose glory days were long behind him, had sought refuge here, hoping the perpetual dust and silence would bury the ghosts of his past. He often stood, shielding his eyes from the relentless glare, trying to blot out not just the sun, but the memories that seared deeper than any desert heat. Thorne carried the weight of a monumental failure, a town he couldn't save, a family he couldn't protect. His uniform was long shed, replaced by the nondescript clothes of a prospector, but the lawman's burden clung to him like burrs. He just wanted to disappear, to let the wind whisper away his name. But the West rarely granted peace to the weary. The threat loomed large, plastered on every peeling wall, a wanted poster bearing the image of Bud Gayson near your eye. His eyes, a chillingly accurate depiction of the rumors, seemed to glow with an unnatural, malevolent light, promising destruction. Bud Gayson wasn't just a bandit. He was a force of nature, ruthlessly expanding his dominion, choking off remote settlements like Whisperwind Gulch by cutting off supply lines and terrorizing the few prospectors who still dared to chip away at the barren hills. The townsfolk, a haggard lot, lived in a constant state of dread, their faces etched with a mix of fear and simmering anger. Old man Silas, whose eyes always darted nervously, had seen Bud Gayson's cruelty up close. Young Jeb, whose face was a mask of raw fury, had lost his meager claim to Bud's expanding empire. One sweltering afternoon, a new shadow fell over Whisperwind Gulch. A quiet, stoic figure rode in, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, a thick, coppery beard catching the sunlight. He dismounted, a well-worn saddle slung over his shoulder, a gleaming revolver holstered low on his hip. This was Clint. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man on a mission, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. He rented a small, run-down cabin and kept to himself, though his presence, calm and formidable, was noted by all. Among the few pillars left in Whisperwind Gulch was Eleanor Vance. Sharp, intelligent, and fiercely determined, Eleanor ran the town's general mercantile, trying to keep her family's legacy afloat despite Bud Gayson's stranglehold. She watched Thorne with a wary eye. She'd seen enough lawmen abandon their posts to trust easily. Yet, desperation gnawed at her. Supplies were dwindling, and fear was turning into despair. Thorne initially wanted no part of it. He'd seen the wanted poster, heard the terrified whispers. He'd even seen the frantic face of a young prospector, screaming in terror after encountering Bud Gayson's men. He just shook his head, retreating deeper into his self-imposed exile, shielding his face not from the sun, but from the appeals in their eyes. The tipping point came with the chilling news that Bud Gayson's gang had systematically burned every family farm in a nearby valley, kidnapping the children and demanding impossible ransoms. This was not mere banditry. It was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. It snapped something in Thorne. He looked at the haunted faces around him, the despair in Eleanor's eyes, the sheer terror in Silas's, the raw anger in Jeb's. He couldn't hide anymore. That evening, in the dusty saloon, Thorne stood up, His voice, rusty from disuse, carried surprising authority. We can't just wait to